Many reviewers thought the picture of Dorian Gray a fetid celebration of drugs, decadence and homosexuality. Some young Oxonians, for example part Irish Lionel Johnson, utterly English Lord Alfred Douglas, took it as a delightful celebration of these things. What was most modernist about the tale, paradoxically, it is an obvious morality tale, was its extension of the model of Pater's Marius the Epicurean, an account of the growth of the hero's soul. Wilde's narrative style was even more ornately ritualistic than Pater's. While the story involves suicide, murder, and corruption, in the foreground one finds only long passages of unrealistically epigrammatic dialogue and longer passages of airless description, apparently for the sake of the rarefied nouns and adjectives in the description. Here is the second sentence of the novel. From the corner of the divan of Persian saddlebags on which he was lying, smoking, and was his custom, innumerable cigarettes, Lord Henry Wotton could just catch the gleam of the honey-sweet and honey-colored blossoms of a laburnum, whose tremulous branches seemed hardly able to bear the burden of a beauty so flame like a theirs. And now and then the fantastic shadow of birds in flight flitted across the long tassel, silk curtains that were stretched in front of the huge window, producing a kind of momentary Japanese effect, and making him think of those pallid jade-faced painters of Tokyo who, through the medium of an art that is necessarily immobile, seek to convey the sense of swiftness and motion. The far-fetched similitude between nature, shadows of birds or drapes, and art, Japanese painting, with all its attendant and irrelevant detail, jade-faced, is typical of a book that is more professedly art fiction than any English novel before it. The early art fiction of W. B. Yeats grew out of his edited collections of Irish stories and lore about Irish fairies. Eser adı yazılmış, onu geçiyorum. His prose proceeded to emulate that of Peter. The crucifixion of the outcast, an aesthetic version of a medieval Irish fable, resembles imaginary portraits, although Yeats' prose is not so opaque or syntactically devious as Peter's. Still, the long list and parallel repetitions so frequent in the Irish tale are both aggressively anti-realist rhetorical figures. They create the effects of a dreamlike beauty of mood. For instance, here is a speech by Camhill, son of Cormac, a medieval minstrel, who is about to be crucified by Irish friars outside an abbey. The minstrel, surrounded by the friars and curious outcasts, is trying to decide to whom to give the food in his wallet. I am myself the poorest, for I have travelled the bare road and by the edges of the sea, and the tattered doublet of party-coloured cloth upon my back, and the torn pointed shoes upon my feet have ever irked me, because of the towered stiff full of noble raiment that was in my heart. And I have been the more alone upon the roads and by the sea, because I heard in my heart the rustling of the rose-bordered dress of her who is more subtle than Angus the subtle-hearted, and more full of the beauty of laughter than Conan the bold, and more full of the wisdom of tears than white-breasted Daedalus, and more lovely than bursting down to them that are lost in the darkness. Therefore I award the tithe to myself, but yet because I am done with all these things I give it to you. with which weirdly complacent oration he flings some strips of bacon to the beggars, then undergoes the nailing to the cross. The significance of Yeats's medieval parable is characteristically modernist. In modern times, the artist is a martyr to the beauty he invents. The poet figure is truth-telling, woman-loving, impoverished yet aristocratic, hated by the religious who fear his rhymes, yet also rejected by the crowds of poor, by the birds, and by the other creatures of the earth, who at the end eat his crucified body. Now we come to the social origins of Irish modernism. The aesthetic fiction produced by Irish writers in the late 19th century, called them the School of Patter, bu önemli bizim için, had certain elements of modernist form. Style as subject, mythic parallels to contemporary life, the philosophy of art for art's sake, realist parody of popular literary styles, and literary art sustained throughout the prose. It didn't, however, feel an obligation to treat modern Irish life directly. The writers who did that best in the 1890s were Edith Somerville, Martin Rose, second cousins who wrote books collaboratively. In 1894, Somerville and Rose produced The Real Charlotte, the finest depiction of Irish gentry society during this decade of its swift decline. Charlotte Mullen is astonishingly detestable for a title character. She is a shabby and hibernized middle-class Protestant of 40 years, very ugly in face and worse in nature. Her principal business is secretly lending out money at interest to the very poor or to friends in a fix, but she also schemes and steals and betrays in order to climb up higher in the social scale of a West Cork village. Her shambling tally-ho lodge, overrun with cats, is as far from being a big house as it is from being a thatched cottage. The driving interest in the plot is Charlotte's relationship to her lively young Dublin cousin and ward, Francie Fitzpatrick, whom everyone loves at first sight and whom Charlotte therefore hates. Charlotte cheats Francie out of her inheritance and then pushes her to marry the feeble but sensitive heir of Bruff Castle. Francie prefers a young captain in the British Army, garrisoned near the village. In his absence, she flirts with the local canon. Any man, in fact, attracted to Francie attracts her in return. The captain, a cat, deserts Francie, who is then successfully pursued in wedlock by the local land agent, upon whom Charlotte had set her own sights. So Charlotte schemes to bring about the destruction of Francie, her own cousin, and a most innocent soul. The novel was obviously written in a spirit of a hatred for the specific person on whom Charlotte was modeled. But if the feeling is personal, the observation of social types, manners, and speech in Dublin suburbs and the Irish countryside is clear-sighted and entertaining. The subject matter is contemporary. Modern would not be the word for Cork in the 1890s, and the social types represented belong to one moment and not to a period before or after that moment. The narrative form, however, is not modernist. The book is written as Jane Austen would have written it had she lived in Castle Townsend, Cork, at the end of 19th century rather than Steventon, Hampshire, at the start of the 19th century. In fact, the real Charlotte alludes several times to Austen's famous ironic epigram that a single man in possession of a good fortune must be in want of a wife. Most of the single men in the Irish tale, as in Pride and Prejudice, are in no hurry to get to the altar. In fact, there is a remarkable infertility in all the houses represented in the real Charlotte. The interior life of the cabins is not represented. This infertility is not thematized by the authors, but it implicitly depicts the Protestant population of Ireland as having lost its capacity to provide the next generation. The ascendancy is on its last legs, decrepit, like its houses. In such fashion, the real Charlotte silently registered the effect of the Land Acts of 1881, 1885, and 1891. The rapid revolution in Irish property ownership set in train by these acts is the main social cause of the Irish revival and a factor in the modernism of major Irish authors. The Irish revival does not begin with the 1891 fall of Parnell, the leader of the parliamentary Home Rule Party. The radical leader of the Land League, Michael David, is its first mover, nor does it prophetically culminate in Patrick Pearse and the Irish Rebellion of 1916, as Yeats's subsequent more nationalist literary history proposed. In a speech celebrating the Irish Literary Theatre in May 1899, George Moore spun a theory to this effect. It was, he said, no surprise that the agrarian revolt of peasants had been followed by a movement inspired by the desire of art for art's sake. Having gained property, formerly landless people asked, what is property for? And those who had lost property, he might have added, asked what the spiritual legacy of that property had been. Indeed, if there is something Irish about Irish modernists, one of the most distinctively national traits is that they were living through a period when the material basis for their own social class was melting away. Yok oluyor gidiyor bakın. They could describe that sooner or later Ireland would break from Britain and Catholics would be in majority in the new and smaller electorate thus created. Kendilerine oy verme haklarını da kabul ediyorlar artık yavaş yavaş. The old dominant class would then have not just less property but less power too. Non-Irish historians of international modernism are accustomed to naming as principal causes of the new stylistic features of 20th century writing the impact of the decline in faith and moral values during the Victorian period, and more dramatically, the impact of the First World War. But those are less important to non-English writers, and most of the modernists, as indicated above, were not English. For the Irish modernists, the key social transformation was what Michael David called the fall of feudalism in Ireland. Wilde, Moore, Yeats, Shaw, Bram Stoker, and others turned to literature to forge in new circumstances identities that were no longer secured in material and social realities.